Hi, my name is Angela Bowie, and today I'd like to provide a short presentation on an element of the Constitution. My focus today will be on how the Constitution stands as a model of cooperative statesmanship, adaptability, and the art of compromise that has lasted for centuries. So the question becomes, how could a 226-year-old document written for a small agricultural nation of 13 states, endure the test of time to apply to today's immense, highly industrialized society, in addition to the United States' role as a world superpower? This is because of the flexibility with which the Constitution was imbued. Now, the framers of the Constitution knew that they could not possibly plan for every circumstance or situation in the future, and they took this factor into serious consideration. As such, they provided various methods by which the Constitution and its laws could be modified as society grew and changed. That is why the Constitution is known by many as a living Constitution, one which can adapt and be flexible as necessary. Through its remarkable stability, the Constitution has continued to amazingly guide American law and political culture, surviving presidential assassinations, depressions, transfers of political power, world wars, rapid technological advancement, acts of terrorism, and social unrest, just to name a few. While today very few question the validity or authority of the Constitution, at the time it was written in 1787, there was much concern about what type of government the newly independent United States wanted to be. Would a constitution infringe upon individual liberties? Would it invest the president with too much power? Ultimately, though, the creation of the Constitution as the national law of the land is a really prime example of how the men of the time were able to use debate and compromise to create a workable, though far from perfect, solution to an incredibly complex problem. The ideas of political philosophers, especially the French Baron Montesquieu and the Englishman John Locke, heavily influenced the shape and nature of the government proposed by the framers. Montesquieu, who actually drew many of his ideas about government from the works of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, was heavily quoted during the Constitutional Convention, and Madison noted in the Federalist Papers the framers' debt to him. Montesquieu, on the other hand, advocated distinct functions for each branch of government, with a system of checks and balances between them, and the Constitution's concern with the distribution of power between states and the national government also reveals the influence of political philosophers, as well as the colonists' experience under its first system of government, the very flawed Articles of Confederation. Now, the first major principle of the Constitution is federalism. It's one of the most important tenets and causes of controversy during the writing of the Constitution. How was a strong central government able to coexist with powerful independent states? As a result, the founders came up with a remarkable concept known as federalism. And under this system, the Constitution vests certain powers to both the national and state governments. And in order to assuage opponents over this issue, James Madison, who wrote most of the Constitution, argued that a strong national government could, if properly directed by constitutional arrangements, actually be a source of expanded liberties and national unity. However, federalism has always been and is still constantly being challenged. Currently, it's by the economic woes faced by government at all levels, especially in the areas of disaster relief, homeland security, and health care, just to name a few. The principle of checks and balances also guided the framers as they designed the new government. Checks and balances is a governmental structure that gives each of the three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, some degree of oversight and control over the actions of the others. The creation of this system allowed the framers to minimize the threat of tyranny from any one branch. Thus, for almost every power granted to one branch, an equal control was established in the other two branches. And as James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Many of the framers clearly feared putting too much power in the hands of any one individual branch of government. And that brings us to our third major principle embedded in the Constitution: separation of powers. Separation of powers is simply a way of parceling out power among the branches of government, and it has a couple distinct features. First, three distinct branches of government: the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, three separately staffed branches of government to exercise these functions, and constitutional equality and independence of each branch. The framers were careful to create a system in which lawmaking, law enforcing, and law interpreting functions were assigned to independent branches of government with no intermingling, although in today's government these lines often get blurred. Now back to checks and balances. I just wanted to show you this chart as a demonstration as to how checks and balances work among our three branches of government. For example, take the legislative branch. The legislative branch has checks on both the executive branch and the judicial branch. Congress can confirm federal judges, it can impeach and remove federal judges, and it can propose constitutional amendments, all which are checks on the judicial branch. Consequently, the judicial branch can declare laws passed by Congress unconstitutional. Legislative branch also has a check on the executive branch. It has several important checks on the executive branch. First, Congress can impeach and remove the president. Congress can override presidential vetoes. The Senate approves presidential treaties. The Senate confirms federal appointments by the president. And the president cannot declare war without approval of Congress. And consequently, the executive branch checks Congress in that it can veto bills passed by Congress, the president can call a special session of Congress, and the vice president serves as the president of the Senate, although this is mostly a ceremonial role, as the vice president is called in only on those few occasions when there is a 50-50 tie in the United States Senate. And then a couple more checks and balances which exist here. The executive branch can check the judicial branch by nominating federal judges and pardoning those convicted of federal crimes, pardons that the judicial branch cannot overturn. And then we have the judicial branch. The judicial branch can declare executive acts by the president unconstitutional, and a little known fact is that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over presidential impeachments. The document finally signed by the framers in 1787 include one preamble beginning with "We the people," to show solidarity and approval of the Constitution by the American people, and it has 7 separate articles. The first 3 articles establish the 3 branches of government, define their internal powers, and clarified their relationship with each other. The other articles define the relationships among states, sets out methods of amending the Constitution, and the Supremacy Act declares national law to be supreme over state laws, and also the process by which the Constitution would be ratified by the people. And this would be done through state ratifying conventions so that Americans would have a say indirectly, but also directly, in how the Constitution could be or would be ratified. Now, Article 5 and the amending power will be the last focus of this presentation. Now, there exists a faction of constitutional scholars who insist that the Constitution should not change. These are known as strict constructionists, and that whatever is not in the Constitution should not be done. However, as an expression of basic and timeless personal liberties, the Constitution does not and should not change. For example, our government cannot destroy freedom of speech, religion, or expression and still remain a constitutional government. But when we consider the Constitution as a system of government and a positive granting of power, we realize that if it does not grow with the nation it serves, it will soon be ignored. Once again, our government and our society is in a state of perpetual evolution. Indeed, the framers could never have conceived of the immense societal change, the rapid technological change, and our commanding role on the international stage over the past 200 years. The viability of the Constitution and the political will of the American people make it possible to adapt to the changing world within the framework of an 18th century document. What makes the Constitution work is due in large part to its adaptability and brevity. It does not attempt to mandate too much, like some constitutions which are hundreds of pages long. In comparison, the original Constitution was only 4 pages long, and any power it does not grant to the federal government, and which is not otherwise expressly forbidden, is left to the states. In other cases, it is left to the courts to interpret it, because in many cases the Constitution can be vague in its meaning. The amendment process. The framers purposely wrote a constitution that would be difficult to amend. They believed that our nation had to be based on a stable constitutional structure that would create respect for the rule of law, and thus foresaw a limited need for amendments. Some argued that the Constitution should be amended only on great and extraordinary occasions, and all amendments to the Constitution must be proposed and ratified by the states. The President and the courts have no formal role in this process. The amendments must first be proposed, and then they are ratified, and there are 2 methods for each. Proposing a method. Amendments. The first method in approving an amendment is by a 2/3 vote of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. All the amendments that have been successfully proposed have gone through this method. The second method for proposing amendments is by a national convention called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. To date, no convention for proposing amendments has been called by the states, primarily because it brings up problematic constitutional and logistical issues that the actual Constitution does not directly address. And then we come to ratifying amendments. In order to ratify an amendment, it must be approved by 3/4 of the states, or 38, in order to become an official part of the Constitution. This method has been used to ratify all amendments but one. The second ratification method, specially called ratification conventions, has only been used once, in order to repeal the 18th Amendment, which enacted the repeal of alcohol in 1919. It is the only amendment that was approved for the explicit purpose of repealing a previously existing amendment to the Constitution, and this was done in 1933. The absence of a Bill of Rights was at the core of opposition to the ratification of the Constitution, led by a group called the Anti-Federalists. They believe it should explicitly outline the limitations of the federal government on the inherent rights of citizens. At each of the state ratifying conventions, the Federalist leaders who supported the Constitution, and also the Anti-Federalists, who actually had a large adherence of followers, they were promised that a Bill of Rights would be added to the Constitution as the first order of business under the new government. So the first Congress under the new Constitution met in New York City in March of 1789, and it had a lot to accomplish. It had many new powers not available to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and every single state had an interest it wanted to protect. Madison had won a seat in the House of Representatives, running partly on a platform that included a fight for a Bill of Rights. And in June of 1787, Madison finally presented his draft of a Bill of Rights. And from June to September of that year, both houses of Congress debated Madison's list along with a list presented by the states. Rights were enumerated, removed, modified, and tweaked. Eventually, both houses agreed on 10 articles of amendments and sent them to the states for ratification. 2 years later, in 1791, the amendments were ratified by the states and they became part of the Constitution. All 10 of the original amendments are referred to as the Bill of Rights. Only the first 9 pertain to the right of the people, while Amendment 10 pertains to the states. So over the next 200 years, the Constitution would be amended 16 times in areas such as the abolishment of slavery, granting black men the right to vote, eliminating the poll tax, enacting the income tax, giving women the right to vote, establishing prohibition, overturning prohibition, lowering the voter age from 21 to 18, establishing a formal process for presidential succession, and a number of other issues. I would encourage you all to read not only the Constitution in its original form, which was written by the Founding Fathers, but all the amendments as well. It all makes for a very interesting and educational read, which will really help in your understanding of how our U.S. government functions. Good luck to you all.